Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Stella Harris.
For as long as I can remember, I've been interested in sex and sexuality. At 13, I was teaching my grandmother genital anatomy. And by 17, I was involved in the kinky, queer, and polyamorous communities in Los Angeles. I even marched in the Pride Parade the first time they allowed a bisexual group. I was used to being the loudest, brightest person in the room because of my big personality. At 19 in college, I met Ira and we started dating. He knew that I was in a long-distance open relationship, but he endured it more than celebrated it. When my other relationship ended, Ira asked if we could be monogamous for a while. I agreed, not just because I was young and in love, but because my relationship with Ira represented a kind of stability that I really craved. So, despite knowing my inclinations towards kink and polyamory, I chose to be in a vanilla monogamous relationship for most of a decade. For a while, it was pretty easy. I got myself lost in domestic life and in building a stable career. I'd had kind of a rocky childhood, so building that stability was really important to me. And having a partner for daily life things is really comforting. We would garden together, we would cook together, and those things have value. But it took a while for me to realize I wasn't actually happy, because the relationship looked pretty good on paper. I was having the kind of sex that television shows about the 1950s like to dramatize. He'd ask if I was interested in sex, and if I said yes, he'd get on top of me and pound away for a while. There wasn't a lot of focus on my pleasure or on foreplay, and I would lay there and stare up at him and watch the beads of sweat form on his brow. And I would pray to any gods of sex that might be listening that they wouldn't drip on me. And when he was done, he would roll off and fall asleep. It's such a cliche, such a common Dan Savage advice call. I'm embarrassed to admit that that was my life for so long. But I told myself that marriage wasn't all about sex. We were a team, and that matters a lot too. But as my husband got more and more involved with his work, I got lonely. And so I started to look for other ways to find connection. A nonprofit group that I followed online put out a call for volunteers, and so I threw myself into that work. And I found it fulfilling and engaging in such a way that it took the contrast of that happiness for me to realize that that was not a thing that I had been feeling for a really long time. Like a frog coming to a slow boil in a pot, I hadn't realized that shoving my loud, bright personality into a tight box was killing me. And I don't just mean figuratively, I was actually having health problems. And so that was a breaking point for me. And I quit my stable job, and I focused on the volunteer work full time. That work had me traveling around the world, and I would be gone for a week or two at a time. When I got back from one of my adventures, my husband said that he wanted to talk. Conversations that start that way rarely end well. So I was immediately nervous. He went on to say that while I was gone, he had been reading some of my books. Interest piqued, I asked which books. It turned out that he had read The Ethical Slut and The Threesome Handbook. So I started to get the idea that this was not a breakup talk. It turned out he was interested in opening our relationship. I tried not to look too excited. I was afraid to move at all for fear that he would bolt like a nervous horse. But he seemed committed to giving it a try. So as our negotiations continued, we ended up adopting the dreaded one penis policy. A few of you might know what I'm talking about. It's a common caveat in newer open relationships. What it went in this instance was that he had to be the only man in my life. but that I could date other women. At first, I was fine with that. I was interested in dating other women also, and I was excited that we were still working on the opening up process. But as he was getting dates and I wasn't, or at least not very many, that started to get very frustrating. At the same time, the prospect of dating at all after 10 years of monogamy was incredibly intimidating. I fell into a kind of self-consciousness that I hadn't felt for years, maybe ever. I started worrying about my skin, and I worried about my weight. I was worrying about how to style my pubic hair. I was driving myself nuts with frustrations, and just as that was reaching its peak, Ira met someone that he really liked, and things were going well. As soon as he got laid, I got the go-ahead to date men again. And so despite all of my nerves and reservations, it didn't actually take that long to meet someone. It turns out that being a woman online makes it really easy to meet people. And so I answered the first message I got that seemed like, oh, this is okay. There was a man named Kyle, and we made a date to meet for tea and a walk in the park. Well, as the date arrived, I fell into all of that self-consciousness again. It turns out a decade of mediocre sex can really take its toll. And my husband had me half convinced that there was something wrong with me. He thought that because our sex life wasn't great, that maybe I was too gay or just not that into sex. And although I should have known better, part of me believed him. Well, the date arrived, and we met, and we got tea, and we walked in the park, and then he invited me to go back to his place. So less than an hour after meeting him in person, I was agreeing to go home with him. Kyle was tall and slender, and he had deep eyes and these striking cheekbones, and he was not the kind of person that I had expected to be interested in me. We got back to his place, and his apartment was also not what I expected. Whatever you're envisioning as a bachelor pad, it's the opposite of that. There were stark white walls and sparse furnishings and almost no decorations, and I felt incredibly out of place. We sat next to each other on the couch, and he asked if he could kiss me. It felt really good to be asked. It set me at ease, and it took away the awkwardness of wondering what was going to happen next. This was the first new person that I'd kissed in 10 years, and he smelled different, and he tasted different, and the way that he touched me was very, very different. After a little while, he suggested that we go to the bedroom, and he took my hand to lead me there. At the time, that seemed incredibly sweet. I was excited, but I was also nervous, and as I crouched in the hallway, trying to get out of my boots, I was having all of these incredibly unsexy thoughts. I hadn't expected a first date to lead to sex, so I had not worn clothes that lent themselves to easy undressing. You know, a flirty little dress you can just whip off. This was winter in Portland. And so I was wearing these boots and tall socks and just layer upon layer of clothes. And then I'm crouching in the hallway trying to spare the white carpets, and I'm wondering, are my feet gonna stink after our walk? And did I remember to wear sexy underwear? It turned out none of that mattered in the face of his enthusiasm. He was complimenting me as he helped me undress. He seemed to be enjoying every part of my body, even the parts that I wasn't yet comfortable with, like my soft belly. And I never had time to lose myself in self-consciousness. Things just kept going too quickly. Before I knew it, I was touching his cock, and there was more kissing, and there was hair pulling, which is one of my favorite things. And once again, I realized, like, oh, right, it's been a long time since I have done these things that I love. And they were just coming so naturally with a new person. We snuggled after sex, and before long, he was hard again and saying he wanted to fuck me again. That might not sound particularly romantic, but at the time, it felt amazing that he just couldn't get enough of me. His obvious desire for me was washing away years of insecurities. I wouldn't necessarily recommend sex with near strangers to boost your self-esteem. But at that time in my life, it was exactly what I needed. We parted ways that day, and I texted my husband to let him know what had happened. And this time, he was able to be excited for me, and he congratulated me. Fast forward a little while, and we ended up having an amicable divorce. We were both changing and growing, and it was time for us to find our happiness in different places. I felt like I had to defend polyamory to people and explain that that wasn't why we had split, and if anything, it had bought us some extra time. These days, I'm much better at staying true to myself. I'm involved in the kink scene, and I have wonderful open relationships with the full enthusiasm and support of my partners, and I have a great sex life. A little side effect of being true to myself and being comfortable in my own skin, as some of you may know, I am once again, quite often, the loudest person in the room.